So let me turn it over to Will Dobson. Will came to my class this morning and again just did an absolutely fantastic job with my students. He's a liberal arts grad. He went to Middlebury College, not quite Colorado College, but liberal arts college nevertheless. And then he went to a small law school attached with this place called Harvard University a little bit after that, and got his law degree and an MA in Asian Studies. Since then, he's become a journalist, a specialist in the long form of investigative and in-depth, detailed reporting. He has background working at Foreign Affairs. He was Asia editor for Newsweek. He was the managing editor for Foreign Policy magazine, and currently he is the political and foreign affairs editor of Slate magazine. Will is one of those journalists / intellectuals / policy people who really truly understands the value of civil society in its role in any democratic society, and that comes very clear in his book, which is featured today, Dictator's Learning Curve. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Will. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I didn't go to Colorado College. That was what I heard. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much for this opportunity to be here today. I want to thank John for the invitation. I want to thank Sky and the Colorado World Affairs Council as well, and all of you for making this. I've been to a lot of World Affairs Councils, and it's a wonderful organization, but it's also, each one has its own character, and I've really enjoyed having a chance to talk to some of you, and I hope we can talk more, and I look forward to your question and answer. I have to confess that I am completely and utterly disoriented, because, a few days ago, I looked at the weather reports, and it looked like, oh, I'm going to Colorado, this is going to be fun. And then right as you pack your bags to go to the airport, it's like, oh, I'm going to that Colorado. Well, what's it going to be tomorrow? I don't know. So I'm completely and utterly confused. I've never. This is my first time in Colorado. So I think I have, my suitcase shows my indecision right now. I didn't know what to bring here. So, but my family is originally from New England and up Vermont way. So I like a winter wonderland as much as anyone. So it's still nice, and I've enjoyed being here the last day or so, and getting out today to actually see more of this beautiful place. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of what I talk about in the book, but we can also take that conversation in other directions. And I want to start with what I think is a fairly, I think it's not a controversial thing to say. I think it's, you can almost call it a truth, which is that these days it's really hard to be a dictator. It's tough work, tough work. Because not long ago, it was a little bit more of a simpler affair. We think of autocrats of not that distant past who were able to keep their population under their thumb with pretty blunt instruments. We think of Stalin's Gulag, we think of Mao's revolutionary campaigns, we think of Pol Pot's killing fields. And the reality is that those tools are very, very ineffective today, that today's dictators find themselves with more forces arrayed against them than really ever before. And you can begin with sort of just the environment that they inhabit, which is that about 20 years ago, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they lost one of their chief lifelines and sponsors. And with that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we know that in that period immediately after, there was an enormous boom, a cottage industry, if you will, in the democracy promotion business. NGOs, activists, groups now are able to shine a spotlight on the work that goes on in authoritarian regimes, whether they like it or not. It was truly incredible growth years. And then there are other structural issues that have changed as well. You take Tiananmen Square in 1989, right before the Chinese Communist Party wanted to declare martial law and then move against the students and workers in the square. The step they took was to pull a plug, to literally pull a plug on CNN's broadcast. So although CNN was there broadcasting from the square, then it went dark. Now we know today that this would be a completely meaningless exercise. You could force CNN off the airwaves, that'd be fine, but we know that if the people in China assembled again in Tiananmen Square, it would be captured on 1,000 iPhones and broadcast in real time. You can say what you want about Syria, but we have never lacked information about what's going on in Syria. Assad very early forbid all journalists from being in Syria. I communicate with journalists in Syria all the time. That doesn't appear to have worked. And it's a very good contrast one can draw, because what Assad is doing isn't that different from what has happened in Syria once before. In 1982, there was an uprising in Syria, and Assad's father crushed that uprising in February 1982. He did it in about a month. We don't know how many people died in Syria in that month. The low estimate is 25,000. The high estimate is roughly 40,000. But what we didn't have was images and information coming out in real time of what was going on. And it's meaningful because look at Syria in 1982. What was it in 83, 84, or 85? It wasn't that different from what it had been in 81 or 80, meaning there wasn't ultimately an enormous price to be paid by that regime for what it did. It was still able to remain a member of the community of nations that it had been a part of before. Say what you want of what will happen in Syria, that will not be the case. That will not be the case for this regime. It has lost its legitimacy. It is harder to be a dictator today, quite fundamentally. In going back to China, any of your misdeeds can be captured so easily. There's an example that really sticks with me from 2006 where there were Tibetans trying to flee China, and they were taking a mountain pass through the Himalayas. And on another one of the mountains, there were PLA soldiers there, and they saw a single file line of Tibetans, men, women, and children, trying to make their way out of the country. And from their position, they were able to just slowly pick them off one by one. What they didn't realize is that on another peak, there were Romanian mountain climbers who captured the entire thing on their phone. As soon as they came down off the mountains, it was put up and broadcast first in European media and then around the world. At 19,000 feet, the Chinese government couldn't get away with that and do it secretly. Were the people stopped? Yes. But did the world know? Yes. There's a spotlight on you now that wasn't there before. And then maybe the most sort of simple, basic way, which is just the empirics of it all. There are more democracies now than there were once before. In 1974, there were 41 democracies, according to Freedom House. By 1991, that number had grown to 76. By 2005, that was over 120. So just by its sheer nature, we've experienced in the last 40 years a tremendous democratic wave, and the space for dictatorship has shrunk in turn. But I say 2005 at that point, and that does represent a high watermark, because, and this is what really fascinated me and something that was it was important for the beginning of my research and doing this book, which I did over the course of 3 years, was that from 2005 on, we've seen a decline in political pluralism around the world. That in those consecutive years, 7 consecutive years, we've seen the longest decline in the last 40 years. That the world's unsavory regimes have made a comeback of sorts. That in 2010, the number of democracies in the world was the number that it had been in 1995. Some people refer to it as a democratic recession, if you will. And even some of the success stories that we had celebrated not that long ago appeared to begin to unravel. I'm thinking of Georgia, Ukraine, and others. And so why is that? What happened? What explains this comeback, if you will? I personally don't think it has much to do with democracy itself. I like to say that it's 2013, and I still don't know how 2011 ended. But what I know about the events that were so incredible in that year, the Arab Spring and even beyond the Arab Spring, because it was bigger than a North African and Middle East phenomenon, is that even amidst a global economic recession, even amidst a time when democracy has taken a good number of hits, it is clearly and abundantly the case that people in that environment were willing to take enormous risks, enormous chances in order to live in a more politically pluralistic, democratic society. Democracy had not lost its appeal. And so, as a result, I think we have to turn the lens to dictatorship itself, that what has changed in many ways is dictatorship, that today's dictators are more savvy, sophisticated, and nimble than we often give them credit for being. We have often in our mind an image of a dinosaur or a South American banana republic, some sort of slow lumbering behemoth, like a la the Soviet Union and ossified Leninist bureaucracy. And that just frankly doesn't actually describe many of these regimes today. In fact, when I traveled to all the countries that I did, including China, Egypt, Venezuela, Malaysia, Russia, for this book, in each place I would go, I would meet with the people that served the regime, the political advisors, the technocrats, the opportunists, the cronies, the businessmen, and then on the other side, I would meet with the people who were trying to overturn the regime, the bloggers, the students, the academics, the lawyers, the civil society activists. And I'll tell you that when I met the people that were serving the regime, they weren't that unlike many of the people that you would find in any government, frankly. Many of them had degrees from some of the best American universities. Georgetown, often. They would ask me, oh, you live in Washington, D.C. Is that little place on the corner of P and is that still there? These are people, these are not sort of the thuggish image that you have of dictatorship, maybe from the movies or maybe just the 20th century writ large. It's different. And what they have done, what I think you begin to look at when you look at these places is that these pressures that I enumerated at the outset, the way in which it's become harder to run a modern authoritarian state, facing these pressures, these regimes did not make the decision to fall back into becoming a police state. They did not cut off their relations from the world, but rather they recognized that they had to move up a learning curve, that they had to learn and adapt on their own. That what we see in place after place is regimes trying, often struggling, to come up with ways to refashion dictatorship for a modern age, coming up with new formulas, methods, and strategies for trying to preserve their power in a time when it's very difficult to do so. I mean, the central tenet of dictatorship is so fundamentally anachronistic to our time. It's about the centralization of power in few hands. That in a moment when information is becoming more dispersed, when organizations are leveling, when information is spreading so quickly, to do so is to do so in a very difficult environment. And so rather than throw in the towel, and rather than become the next North Korea, because understand, no one wants to be the next North Korea. That's an anomaly. That is to fall back into a defensive crouch and, in a sense, really cede the victory at the outset. No, what they want to do is they want to coexist in this world, but do so in a way that the political power doesn't change hands. It's a trick. It's difficult. So what are those methods? If, for example, we're talking about a place like Russia, if you run an NGO in Russia and you run afoul of the Kremlin, it is not likely that you will be disappeared in some night. No, more likely is that there'll be a knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a bright sunny day, and they'll say, we're here to see your paperwork. It's a tax inspector. And they'll find that there's a problem with your paperwork. It's actually very difficult to keep up with the rules because they're always changing. And as a result of that, you'll go through what it will appear to be a rather legal procedure, which will lead to your organization being shuttered. More NGOs have been closed in Russia because of health code violations than anything else. A health inspector is a very powerful tool for a modern authoritarian. In a place like Venezuela, laws are written very broadly, and then they're used like a scalpel against those that the government deems a threat. So as one activist there put it to me, he said, the motto of this regime should really be, for my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law. It's effective. You take the media environment in these places. Does the regime control media? Absolutely. Does it have 100% control of media? Not usually. Actually, they often find that it's good to have a certain amount of freedom for the press in certain areas. It's useful because, one, it's a great way of finding out what people actually think. That's helpful. It's also useful in a place like China, for example, where the party knows that everyone is corrupt in the party. They know that. But they need to know who's egregiously corrupt. And the only way to do that is to have a few financial journalists who are actually allowed to do their job. So to the degree that you can see any opening of press freedoms in China, it's really been targeted and selected in that sphere, financial journalism. It's a useful tool. Or you can say, I pointed out at the outset that civil society has been an important factor in putting pressure on these regimes. So these regimes understand that they need to have their own civil society. So are many of you familiar with the phrase or the term gongos? Government-operated non-governmental organizations. Got that? So essentially, this is an organization which is intended and is there to confuse all of us, but certainly people like myself, a journalist, someone who parachutes into a country, they're there and they want to get a handle on the human rights situation. And so they say, okay, I need to talk to somebody from a human rights NGO. This one's called the Human Rights Organization for the Betterment of the People of Egypt and the Advancement of it. And I'm like, oh, okay, sounds good. I don't know what that means, but that sounds like they're on the right side. And then you go and you meet these people and you find out, they'll say, well, it's interesting, the questions you raise, yes, you're right. We do have a lot of problems here. You're right, you've put your finger on a very important issue. What you need to understand is we've got some bad apples. And we're on a road, we're on a process, and we're evolving towards a better day. And it really reminds me even of your own country's history. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, really, that you had many of these problems that we have here too, right? And so it's a much more sophisticated retort than, no such thing as what you're saying happens here. Everything is perfect in land X. No, they understand that they can't get away with that. So it's at the level of civil society. All of these regimes are perfectly fluent in the language of human rights and democracy promotion. The statements that were coming from the Egyptian Foreign Ministry in 2009 and 2010, right up to the edge of the revolution, if you took the names off, it sounded just like something that was coming out of any humdrum Scandinavian bureaucracy. It sounded great. It wasn't. They were talking about human rights, although they were the chief perpetrator of human rights abuses. And then, of course, there's just elections. I mean, that's right there in the manual. You've got to have elections. If you're going to run a modern authoritarian state, you got to do that. And you could say, well, I mean, that's always been the case, right? I mean, the Soviet Union had elections. Brezhnev wins with 99%. Sure. The modern authoritarian understands that winning an election with 99% is ridiculous because it's obviously a sham. Why is there any value in winning an election that is so clearly fraudulent? The only elections that are worth stealing are elections that appear to be contested. As a result, 70% is the new 99. You want to win with 70%, somewhere in there, because then you can say, look, the opposition did pretty well. Yeah, I mean, hats off to them. I mean, we won. Yeah, we won. But they gave it a good go. And even those opposition parties themselves are often an appendage of the regime as well. And you see that time and time again. It's interesting because you have to look at a lot of these. These are regimes that are trying to occupy a gray space between what we conventionally think of as democracy and what we conventionally think of as dictatorship. So there was a Russian dissident her words really stayed with me. I mean, her activism, she's been at this a long time. She became an activist during the Soviet Union. Her days go all the way back to Brezhnev. And we were talking about the Russia that she lives in today. And she said, Will, you have to understand that my constitution, the constitution that we have here today in Russia, is really, honestly, every bit as good as yours. It has, go through it, read it, it has the rights and guarantees that you have. The difference is that the only right that's actually observed here is the right to leave. Because if Putin has had many insights, but if he had one that was actually, not bad, it's perhaps from his period of time as a KGB officer in Dresden. He was in East Germany at the end of the Cold War. He watched the wall come down. That's where he was stationed, his only foreign post. And when he was there as a relatively young man in his 30s and living in East Germany, as a Soviet KGB officer, he was shocked at how invasive and totalitarian the state was. He thought, how could anybody do it like this? This is ridiculous. He saw the cables going back to Moscow. He saw what a pyramid scheme the economy was. He knew this couldn't work. And he said, not long after, that he understood that a system built on walls would never stand, that would not work. But he doesn't need to accomplish those goals with walls. He can accomplish those goals with a passport and a welcome to say, you know what, why don't you join the rest of the Russian community in London? They like it there. You might like it too. Goodbye. So there are many ways in which these regimes are able to innovate, and we can talk about more. There are many. But I would be wrong, and this is important, is that I said at the outset that when I spent maybe a year doing research for this book, but I spent 2 years traveling and going to all these places. I would not just spend time with these people, which was rather depressing, but rather I also would spend time with the people who are really trying to bring change to these places. And I'm happy to say that these people are moving up their own learning curve as well, and that the people that are challenging these regimes are every bit as nimble and savvy and learning at a faster clip than these regimes. They are in many cases, when they're doing it right, setting the agenda. And it became important for me as I went through this that I recognized that there were certain fundamental things that we, and by we I now mean really the media and people who care about these issues, are often missing. And yet you could be forgiven for it because it's never really presented to you like this. And I really very much wanted to present that to people in my book, which is that when you saw tens of thousands of people streaming out of their homes and amassing in Tahrir Square in January 2011, you could be forgiven for thinking that on that given morning, tens of thousands of Egyptians all of a sudden spontaneously had the same idea. You know what? You're right, he's been here for 30 years, but it's today that it's become untenable. But if you think about that, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, obviously that cannot be the case. And the fact of the matter is that revolutions are seldom spontaneous, although they're almost always presented like that. It's a good narrative. It is a really good way to get TV ratings. It's a great way to sell magazines. Sorry. But it's not true. The reality is that there's often tremendous work, often tedious work, learning that goes on before to lead up to those days. And what we fail to do is we fail to pay attention to this work when it's just a small grassroots movement. We're not paying attention when a group of people is learning how to mobilize a movement. We're not paying attention when they're learning how to chip away at a regime's legitimacy. We're not paying attention when they're mastering the tools of propaganda. We hold as a standard that if a group has not somehow toppled a dictator, then there's absolutely nothing going on in that place. Well, or if there is, oh, it's just so sad. It's just a failure, one failure after another. And does that happen? Of course it happens. But it's only a failure if these groups are trying tactics, losing, and then gaining nothing from it. What we're missing is that many times they're trying something and then they're coming back another day and doing it slightly differently. They're learning. And we're not seeing that learning until we get something that's dramatic for Wolf Blitzer to talk about. The hard work has already been done. And so I very much wanted to show that work that was being done. And when you see that, I had this experience again and again, leaving Malaysia, leaving Venezuela, leaving Russia, having met these people, saying, I would not want to be in opposition to these people. Because the people that I was meeting, these were not romantics. The romantics do not last long in this fight. These were battle-scarred tacticians from all walks of life. It was the mother of two on maternity leave right outside of Moscow who woke up to her activism years ago, and it began by just trying to protect a forest. Now it's not about the forest. Now she's just simply one of the Kremlin's chief nemesis. And she's now all of 37 and had no political background whatsoever. You could never have seen her coming. She's brilliant. I call her in the book, she's Napoleon without the complex. And there are people like this again and again and again. And so there are certain myths that we have to dispel, and it's important that we dispel them because when you recognize that, when you understand that it's at this level that the conflict is being waged, you understand then that the contest between democracy and dictatorship is very rarely today a contest between nations. It's a contest between people within countries. And to do that, you have to get up close and meet these people and understand what they're doing. And then you can begin to see where the real fulcrums of change are. So I spent this time traveling and meeting these people and reporting on it, and I came away optimistic for that. And I came away optimistic for two other reasons. One, what we can see, and we can talk about this as well in the question and answer, is that the regimes that even have been able to hold on, they are not learning at the same pace anymore. The mistakes that we see Putin making today, the incredible mistakes that we see being made in Caracas today, is evidence of the fact that there seems to be a bit of a ceiling, a bit of a slump in their curve. So that's another reason to have optimism. And then maybe a third reason, and a really relevant and nice reason to point out, is that there are so many ways in which there are unexpected people and unexpected networks that are stepping up to sort of tilt the scales in this struggle. And to be quite frank, you all have the benefit of having two of those people here today in Sergio and Slobo. It is an organization like Canvas that regimes never saw coming. It's the effort by two people who understood that their experience was one that, well, there was demand for, that there were people who were coming to them of their own free will, saying, we know what you did there, and we want to do it here too. And so, fortunately, they set up Canvas. They established an organization that's now trained democratic movements in more than 50 countries. And I had the privilege a couple years ago of watching one of these training sessions occur. And you very quickly learn the way that people learn and the hunger for the information from the activists, and how they're learning they're learning incredible and very important macro strategic lessons. But, there's also smaller lessons, concrete, tangible things that carry over from one experience to another that they take back with them as well. And I watched these people, their eyes light up as the light bulbs started to go off for them over the course of a Canvas training session, and they take that information back home with them. And it's something that's just fundamentally different, that we need to understand that these groups now are learning in all these ways, and they're also learning from each other. It was often the case, almost always the case, that when I would be with a Venezuelan student group, for example, in Caracas, they'd say, they knew about what I was doing, they knew about my book, and they'd say, I'm actually really fascinated about what's going on in Russia. Is there somewhere there you can introduce us to? And the Egyptians who would say, I know that everyone likes to say that the Iranians failed in the Green Movement, and I guess there's some truth to that, but I saw a number of things they did that we really want to do here. And then they already started doing them. The level at which this information is both happening, is being shared naturally, but also people are taking those steps to make those linkages. And so now go back to our dictator alone in his room, thinking, I now not only have to combat these people that I know are out to get me, who want to bring change to this country, but I also have to worry about the wellspring of knowledge from all these other groups, and that I know they're talking. So, yes, it's a hard day to be a dictator, but I think it's only going to get harder. So, thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some time for Q&A, and thank you to Pikes Peak Library District for putting this on the web for us. And okay, so we'll take some questions. Yes, sir.
I heard you speak about several countries, Venezuela, Syria, and so on. What about Cuba? What is going on there?
Okay, so the question is, what about Cuba? What's going on there?
Cuba's a fascinating case. Because what you're finding there is it's going through an experience now that is a first for it, which is it's actually it has to try and see if it can transfer leadership away from the Castro family to anyone else. And so that leadership transition technically just happened only a couple months ago now, where you now have someone who's risen up through the ranks who has now been designated the next leader of Cuba. This is a moment of great risk for an authoritarian regime. It's not really clear that the bureaucracy itself is going to transfer its loyalties as smoothly as they'd like, given the rough environment in which the regime has to operate. What is that environment? There's a lot of things that Fidel Castro did that, qualify as really quite genius from the point of view of political strategy. But maybe his final act, his final sort of home run, if you will, was to replace the Soviet lifeline with the Venezuelan lifeline. When I mentioned before, there were so many regimes that collapsed after the collapse of the Soviet Union because they lost that sponsorship. Cuba should have been one of them, but Castro recognized early on that there was a future for Cuba if it could attach itself to the Venezuelan state, which is what has happened. So now, so much of what we talk about in terms of Cuban governmental resilience, actually, it isn't based in Havana. You have to look at it in Caracas. There are roughly 5,000 Cuban political officers and security officers who work in the Venezuelan government. A few years ago, when the student movement was at a bit of an uptick, it was at the same time that the country in Venezuela was having rolling blackouts. And this was a big source of concern because it was something that actually affected the whole population. And one of the new minister of electricity and utilities in Venezuela was a former Cuban minister. And he was brought in for his expertise on these issues. Actually, he had no expertise on those issues. He was a former minister of interior in Cuba. He knows about electricity, but not how to light up a city. And so there is enormous congruence between these places. And now, today, Cuba relies on Venezuelan oil, and it actually surpasses the amount of oil that Cuba consumes, so that 40% of what it receives from Venezuela, it re-exports for revenue. So this is what we see going on in Venezuela right now. There's no one more concerned about that than Havana, because they recognize that their future very much rests on how the political process and how Nicolas Maduro fares, which right now I'm sure is not a source of calm and comfort.
Yes, sir. Okay. The question is, what about Chechnya and its relationship to recent events in this country and elsewhere?
Chechnya has a very tortured history. I mean, it goes back all the way. The Chechen people were some of the worst persecuted by Stalin. It is an area that has, and then of course from after the end of the Cold War, has been under constant bombardment, attack, and oppression from Moscow. So what you've seen a brutal campaign there in order, in many ways, to target Muslims in Chechnya, which has most likely had the effect of only further radicalizing the population there. Leadership of Chechnya, it's interesting. I mean, in many ways, you can talk about modern authoritarianism, Putin's sophistication. None of it applies to Chechnya. Chechnya is truly living in another time, and it's probably medieval. And so, I mean, there is a strong man. I mean, to go back to those elections, I said, and this is a very good sort of, this tells you everything you need to know. I said before, only Brezhnev wins with 99%. Now you want to win with 70%. Not in Chechnya. The last election they held in Chechnya, people who were standing up for election, they won by 99%. So it's in many ways, you can consider Chechnya as like a fossil.
Is there a grassroots movement in Chechnya, and is there some international concern with that?
A grassroots movement of what particularly?
Well, the thing that I'm thinking probably most people linked to Chechnya as human rights abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any grassroots organizations that are really finding their voice to combat that?
I mean, it's a place where it's almost impossible for people to operate. I mean, there have been many very brave human rights defenders who've worked in Chechnya, and I'm sorry to say that many of them are no longer here. That this is not a corner of Russia that has tolerated this, because the Chechen government has broad leeway to treat these people and crack down as violently as it sees fit. And in large part, it factored into part of the legitimization of Putin's rule as well. I mean, Chechnya was very important to Putin in the sense that it was a quote-unquote foreign threat, if you will, that it could use to say, we are in danger because of terrorists there, and we will, I mean, as he once said, we will kill them in their outhouses. I mean, he's been very clear about there would be zero tolerance. It would be, he's advertised it as nothing but the brutal campaign that it was. So I am not aware of any grassroots. I'm not aware of it. That's not to say that it's not there, but I can't imagine many climates for that type of work that would be more treacherous to work in.
Yes, sir.
Question regards the future of the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi in Egypt.
Well, we could spend the rest of the day talking about this topic. That's a big one. You know, I'll actually go back a little bit before we get to Morsi and say, you know, it's difficult if you're trying to put a label on what the Egyptian regime was, and labels are, by their definitions, simplifying. I think that probably the most appropriate label for what that regime was a military dictatorship. That although there was a political facade in the National Democratic Party, that at the root, what the spine of the regime was the military. Every president of the modern Egyptian state has been a military officer, someone who's taken off the uniform, put on a tie, and become president. The military effectively had worked out a relationship with the political state to say, as long as you can protect our prerequisites and our life here, you'll be able to remain in power, and in return for that, we'll get quite rich. And so the military it's the military Inc. is what I mean. Almost anything in Egypt that the roads are paved by the military, the water is bottled by the military, the bread is baked by the military, the tourism package that you bought to go down the Nile was by a tourism company that is owned by the military. So again and again and again, you may not even realize you're interacting with the military when in fact you are. Now, take to the events of 2011 and Mubarak is ousted, and the military comes forward and says, we've heard you. Don't worry, there'll be change. What changed actually? Was that a revolution or was that succession? Because the only question that was animating Egyptian society for the previous, say, 6 years was who was the next leader going to be after Mubarak, his son or another general? In a way, they were trying to answer that question. The difference is that the Egyptian military did, I believe, long for having an operation like it had before, which is to say, we want to have that certainty, we want to have that control, we want to maintain our privileges, but who wants to be in the hot seat? It's not particularly great, we're not that good at it, and at the end of the day, it'd be better to have someone else out front. Now, in those elections, you know, by most people's account, those elections were reasonably fair, and it was a good indication of people's preference, and Morsi won. What's been astonishing, I think, to many people is to see how Morsi has reacted to this, which is that in many ways, and I point this out in my book, that in many ways he has responded in a way that's more autocratic than what was there before him. He certainly has done it in record land speed. If you go back to when Sadat was assassinated and when Mubarak was elevated to president, in the first several years, he recognized that he was a complete and utter political neophyte. That's why he was the vice president. Sadat didn't see him as a threat. Henry Kissinger once was in a meeting with Sadat and Mubarak. He thought Mubarak was a secretary. He had no idea that that was the vice president of Egypt that was sitting behind the president. So this was a very unassuming man who I think probably also recognized that he was in over his head initially. And so what did he do initially? Initially what Mubarak did was he actually acted like a political liberalizer. Sadat at the end had become very abusive. And so one of the first things Mubarak did was let people out of the political prisons. He let the opposition parties open up their newspapers again. When he traveled abroad, he brought opposition party members with him on his entourage to go to foreign capitals. He seemed to be inclusive until he figured out how the game was played. And then things changed. In the case of Morsi, you could imagine that this would be a person who could, if he could read the winds correctly, he could say, this is a great opportunity for me if I strike the right tone. Early on, some of his first speeches did sound inclusive, but whether it's because he's not that bright or because he's that insecure, that changed very, very quickly. And so some of the powers that he's tried to take, had they actually been granted to him, which in some instances they weren't, he would have actually legally had more power than Mubarak had when he was ousted. So I don't think that what we've seen of the political record of Morsi right now is to suggest that he will be a figment of the Egyptian political state for a very long time. I don't think that's the case. He wasn't even the choice of the Muslim Brotherhood. He wasn't their top choice. So, in his defense, he's operating in an environment that no one has operated in modern Egyptian history. Because what is different? One thing that you can say is without question different, is that the Egyptian people now see themselves as having a role. That wasn't the case before. So one thing Mubarak had going for him is that he was working with a population that was far more apathetic. Morsi does not get that benefit. When he screws up, the street fills. And so the pressure on him is much, much greater. And what am I concerned right now, at this moment, is that what we're seeing is a growing nostalgia for the military in Egypt. Because for the people that you need to have your minority movement become a successful majority movement, it requires people who are not necessarily very politically active. It requires the small businessman who only wants to get up and be able to open up his shop and sell his wares. And at what point does that person say, you know what, I was inspired by what I saw, but at this point, I can only open up my business 2 or 3 days a week because these people are having rallies, because it's not safe, because there are guns in the street now, the cars are burned out shells. Maybe it was better before. That's a very dangerous sentiment to come in. And my concern is that there is a military officer in the Egyptian military who will quickly take off his uniform, don a tie, and that will seem a lot like what we saw once before. So then you are left with, was it a revolution or was it just succession? Yes?
What do you think the international community's role and responsibility is in dealing with the modern dictator?
What is the international community's role dealing with the modern dictator?
Wow, these questions, you could just, again, we could do the whole day for this. That's a great question. There are many ways. One would be sort of the oath that doctors take, which is do no harm. That would be a good place to start, which is that in many instances, it's a very delicate dance that not just, and this isn't just to say of the United States, but of other foreign democratic powers, is that it's easy to go back into one example. It's very easy to criticize the Obama administration for not having done more. We can leave open what more is to help the Green Movement in Iran. But it becomes much more difficult when you begin to realize that overt support for an indigenous movement in a foreign country is a surefire way of delegitimizing that movement. And that ultimately, at the end of the day, that if the regime's first response to these movements is to say it's a CIA plot, these are foreign influenced fighters. Why would you want to do anything to actually add credence to that claim? Because these people are engaged in a struggle where they're trying to convince people who are not part of their movement, but are their neighbors, to join them. So, on some level, you need to keep a distance, which is difficult for Americans. I mean, on some level, there's an American impulse to want, in some instances, to try to be part of the solution, when in fact that can backfire very quickly. So there's that. But there are other ways in which, time and time again, this is just a very basic sort of metric for this, is that I've told you that I'm traveling around to all these places and I'm meeting people that work for the regimes and I'm meeting people who are trying to oppose the regimes. People that are opposing the regimes are doing very dangerous work. That's obvious. How often did the people that I was interviewing, I interviewed more than 200 people, how often were the people that I was interviewing asking for their comments to be off the record, to remain anonymous sources? Almost in every instance, it was someone who worked for the regime. Think about that. These people are challenging this government. They are not the police force, they are not the military, but they, in many instances, would say, yes, I'll talk to you, I'll answer your questions, you can fill up your notebook with what I have to say. And then I'd say, is it okay if it's on the record? And I had a number of people say, well, let me put it to you this way, Will. If my name is not associated with my comments, you may not use them. I insist that I be on the record. Because they were working in an environment where it's fundamentally important that they understood that the more their name was known, the more that they worked in the open and not in the shadows, the safer they were. It's interesting to me that that was often not a feeling felt by people that were part of the state, that were part of the political apparatus, that they felt that they needed protection. It tells you a lot about the motivations and climate in which these people are working. And that wasn't always true. In a place like China, it was very different. You know, I arrived in China. China is a large part of my background in Asia in general, but I was one of the most fascinating trip I ever took to China was 10 days after Mubarak fell. And right as I arrived, there were many people that I had intended to interview and meet. And these were people who were immediately put under house arrest because of the events that were happening in Egypt. And there was one person, a lawyer, and many of the bravest human rights defenders in China today are lawyers, who he wasn't under house arrest because he wasn't home. And he was in Shanghai, but he lived in Beijing. And I contacted him, and he said, okay, here's how we're gonna do this. I'm gonna fly back to Beijing, and I'm gonna go directly to this tea house, and I'm gonna meet you there. I'm not gonna go home first, because if I go home, we may never meet. And so he went directly to this tea house. I met him there, and he said, well, you know, of course, you know, they do know that we're meeting. And I looked at him, and he said, well, my security minders were on my flight. My phone is bugged. He said, so right now, actually, they're out there, and they're fully aware. And he said, and when I was getting off the plane and getting my luggage, I went up to one of them, and I said, oh, by the way, I'll be meeting with him. I told them, and I said, you asked them? He said, I asked them nothing. I don't ask them which friends I meet with, I tell them. And this was this person who, his job, he's a free speech attorney in China. Tell me who has a harder job than that. And this guy wins his cases, if you can believe that. How does he win? He wins by embarrassing the regime to such an extent that the judge can't issue a verdict. Because if he issues a verdict that this guy wins, he'll get in trouble with his bosses. But if he issues a verdict for the other side, which is almost always a government official, it will be so just baldly apparent that the whole system is corrupt that it could cause a riot in the street. So what happens is a verdict is never delivered. It just goes, and he's like, and that's a win. That's how you win. That's how we have our Sullivan case in China is won that way. No verdict at all. So there are people that take these risks, and it's you know, I think, you know, your question was, you know, how can we have a role? I think we have to tread very carefully. And these people will tell you, one, know our names. Two, it does matter what you say. It matters to us when we hear a foreign government, when we hear the United States, when we hear others recognize our struggle. Because that is something that it lets the regime know that this is something that others are paying attention to, and that's vitally important.
David?
To what extent is there dissension within the
Okay, I think I got that right. No, I missed that. I'm sorry. Do you want to try to repeat?
Sure. So I mean, what I understand you to be asking is to what degree is there tensions within, no, you're saying the anti-regime forces or the dissidents? How much is there tension between them? Well, yes. I mean, there can be incredible tension between these groups. I mean, you can look at just sort of the aftermath of something like Tiananmen Square. There are many of the student leaders from Tiananmen Square that can't be in the same room with each other. And then some of them maintain their work, but they disagree. I mean, you know, dissidents are just like everyone. They have egos, you know, things happen. You know, it's their ability to overcome those things that separates many from being successful or not successful. I mean, I would take the Venezuelan opposition as being a wonderful example of it. In many ways, it couldn't overcome it. You know, in the case of Venezuela, it's really hard to argue that Chavez wasn't a consequence of corruption and incompetence and governmental failure that had gone on for years or maybe even 2 decades. So when Chavez wins and the people that were part of those earlier governments form your political opposition, I mean, you could forgive the Venezuelan voter for saying, no, I don't want to give you another try. I mean, that certainly didn't work. And there was incredible egos between those as to who would actually have the mantle of being the true opposition leader. How did that get resolved ultimately? It got resolved by the people that lead the Venezuelan opposition have no part in that period of the country's history. So now, today, the smartest, most dynamic, creative, thoughtful, brave opposition leaders in Venezuela are between the ages of 37 and 45. And they weren't really, they hadn't had, their political resume doesn't really extend back to that period. It took a generation change. It honestly took 10 years I mean, Chavez got a 10-year pass before he ever actually had an opponent that was worthy. And we see that now in a man like Enrique Capriles, who is incredibly worthy. I interviewed him for my book, and the opposition, I mean, I'll give you just one example. So this creativity from the point of view of political opposition, I went to watch him open up a school and this was in a Chavista stronghold area. And he was opening up this new school for it was like a primary school. And they gave me, before he showed up, they gave me a tour of the school. And it's a school. So you open up the door, there's a classroom, there's a chalkboard. Okay, open up another door. Chalkboard, yeah. Open up another door. It was a dentist's office. And I said, wait a minute, dentist, I mean, why is there a dental chair? Why is all this medical equipment? And he said, oh, well, you understand is that as soon as Capriles won the state, became the governor's state, the central government began to seize all of these assets from us. They began to take medical offices, garbage trucks, they cut the water supply, all these things to make his period in office be considered a failure. And so what we understood is that when we do something like create a school, something that the community is going to truly embrace, what we can do is we can take some of those state competencies, like dental care, and we will insert them right into the school. Because that's something the central government can't take back. They wouldn't dare. And you've got to be creative like that to be able to, and he's like, that's how I'm able to have the approval ratings I have. The Venezuelan doesn't care that the central government is making it hard for me to be your governor. Like, at the end of the day, they need water. So you either figure out how you get them water, or you don't deserve to be their leader. And so, again, a really hard job. Try being an opposition leader in an authoritarian country.
Yes. Okay. A question relates to celebrities visiting dictators overseas. What do you think about it? Is there some positive benefit from this dialogue that might be established?
No. Could there be anything? It would be possible. Unfortunately, our celebrities don't usually wade into these issues in a way that is as constructive as we'd like. I mean, Venezuela has done better work with Hollywood than anyone in terms of the interventions of Sean Penn. I don't think have advanced the cause of the Venezuelan people in any way. And that's true of Danny Glover and so on and so forth. So no, I mean, it would be nice. You should, it's a good idea to consider any opportunity, but no, I don't think that this was a beginning of any possible line of communication or rapprochement between two sides. It certainly, if it has, it certainly has, I think, escaped everyone.
Okay, Scott.
You've already mentioned that in the context of do no harm, that there is not a lot that the United States can do to intervene on behalf of those who are fighting a regime. Could you also comment about the ability to affect anything with respect to punitive sanctions of whatever sort against a regime itself? Or if the answer to that is equally negative, do we sit back and watch?
Okay. I think that made the microphone, but the question is, I think that made the microphone. We felt it's pretty hard to follow.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there anything we can do if we shouldn't be too closely involved, or how do we affect the regime? I mean, there are ways to affect. I mean, let's go back to the North Korea example. It's like, okay, so if Dennis Rodman isn't the answer, what could be the answer? I mean, oh gosh. Understand what the regime is. Understand that the North Korean regime is essentially a mafia state, and that in a system such as that, what's very important for the second-tier leadership, which in the case of North Korea is about 30 families, is that there are reasons why they tolerate the regime that they live in, and they are part of it. And it's because there are benefits that come from serving that regime. And if anything ever were to threaten those benefits, then they may question whether or not they have the right leader in place or not. So what are those benefits? That means being able to travel abroad. It means having a fleet of Mercedes. It means the offshore bank accounts. So has there ever been anything the United States has done vis-a-vis North Korea. We could sort of draw a line and say, did this, there was a positive result. I think so. One particular case was freezing North Korean bank accounts in Macau. When we did that, we were freezing enormous sums of money from exactly that tier of people. Very quickly after that was done, the North Koreans came back and said, we are interested in the six-party talks again. That went right to the livelihood of the regime itself. It's unfortunate that we have an office in the Treasury Department that called OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control. Talk about anachronisms. Most of the desk officers that work in OFAC, 75% of them are focused on Cuba. They're not focused on Sudan, where again you have a state where if you were to target the finances of people right under Bashir, you might actually be able to have a conversation. Instead, they're chasing Cuban assets. Honestly, if we ended that policy, we would do more to change Cuba overnight than anything else. So there are things you can do and I think in many cases it means not focusing on the population and trying, because when you're punishing a population through sanctions, you're working on a theory that the regime will care about its population. So instead, you want to focus those on the regime itself. So is there a space for this? Yes, there is. And there's also a cost for being slow to this. I had a very incredible conversation with, I'll call him a Western diplomat in Cairo, who said, the Egyptian people, he told me this after the revolution, he said, the Egyptian people will remember what we did for them. And I looked at him and I said, you're absolutely right, but not the way you mean. He honestly believed that the Egyptian people owed a debt to the American government because of the amount of money that we've given the Egyptian military over time and supported Mubarak. That's not, and so he's right, they do remember, and there is a cost for the United States being so slow to change its policy. I think what's important though is that, I'm not unrealistic about what that is. There's a reason why we should, the focus is on indigenous groups in these countries. Tunisia was a close, reliable ally of the United States until the moment that Ben Ali went to the airport. And as soon as he went to the airport, U.S. foreign policy towards Tunisia changed because he wasn't there anymore. But up until that point, that wasn't the case. The night that happened, the State of the Union speech that President Obama delivered was changed in order to include comments about the events in Tunisia because Ben Ali was fleeing. But there was no mention of Egypt in that speech, although the Egyptian people were already out in the streets. And it took several days before that was recognized. And in fact, we continued to defend Mubarak at that point as a stable ally. So, again, I think it's unrealistic to imagine that in most instances the United States is going to be the forefront of the change. These cannot be exported. It has to be built from inside. And then, can the U.S. play a role? Yes, it can, but it follows that. It doesn't lead it.